All right, guys, good to see you again. This is Mr. Wolf, and this time the book I'm going to be reading you is called An Expedition Back Through Time, On This Spot. And the story is written by Susan Goodman, and the pictures, the illustrator is Lee Christensen. And the book was published by Green Willow Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins Publishing. And the book is titled On This Spot. This is New York City. New York hums and hurries and races and rumbles from under its sidewalks to the sky up above. Buried in the earth, the subway travels to all parts of the city. Each day it takes millions of people to work and school, to plays on Broadway, and to stores along Fifth Avenue. Cars and buses drive down busy streets. Trucks and taxis honk their way up crowded avenues. In the sky above, airplanes bringing even more people to the city. About 8 million people live here. There are so many New Yorkers that if it laid out head to toe, they would stretch all the way to California and back again. All these people help make New York one of the biggest, busiest cities in the world. But on this spot, "175 years ago, New York was a different city. Horse-drawn carriages bumped their way over cobblestone streets. Oil lanterns lit up its nights. Bakers and milkmen pushed their carts through the city. Some peddlers sold corn that was grown on farms along Fifth Avenue. Other peddlers sold water because city wells did not have enough water for everyone. About 160,000 people lived in this New York, just enough, if stretched out in a line, to cross into the neighboring state of Connecticut. There were chickens in almost every backyard. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the wild pigs that ran through the streets." And on this spot, "350 years ago, a fort and its cannons guarded the city of New Amsterdam. Windmill blades turned round and round, providing power to cut logs into boards for new houses and sailing ships. 5 wardens watched over the city's tall houses. Their leather buckets stood waiting to douse any blaze. After dark, a rattle watch took its turn on patrol, walking city streets. He called out the hour, ready to sound his rattle at the first sign of danger. On the blackest of nights, when the moon was hiding, every 7th house hung out a lantern to brighten his way. Fewer than 1,500 people lived in New Amsterdam, but 18 different languages echoed through its streets. Portuguese fur traders argued over prices. Dutch children shouted to playmates. French women visited with neighbors at the community well. If all these people stopped talking and stretched out in a line, they'd form a human bridge between today's New York City and the Statue of Liberty in its harbor." And on this spot, 400 years ago, a great forest grew with walnut trees standing next to oaks and maples. Elk ate the grass. Bears gobbled blackberries from bushes and grapes from vines. Cougars and bobcats watched from the trees above. The Lenaps hunted in the forest for deer and wild turkey. In spring, they crossed through it to find fish in their warm weather campsites by the water. In fact, they followed their trails back inland to harvest corn and firewood. One of those trails, which stretched north and south, eventually became a street named Broadway. And on this spot, 15,000 years ago, there was no forest at all. Cold winds blew across rocky hills. The winds and weather were so fierce that plants could not grow very tall. Instead, some of them grew in dense mats that hugged the ground. Growing so close together helped these plants keep warm. Each year, spring painted the hillsides in fresh, bright colors. New leaves splashed green against the brown branches of tiny birch and bilberry. Soft moss beds unfolded in velvet shades of jade and emerald. Flowers filled the season's rainbow: dandelion yellow, saffrage purple, and rhododendron red. The Arctic fox and snowshoe hare wore new colors as well. They shed their winter white for grayish-brown coats to blend with their springtime surroundings. The woolly mammoth standing tall in the landscape, did not need to worry about camouflage. And on this spot, "20,000 years ago, the weather was much colder. Ice wrapped the landscape in brisk whites, frozen blues, and chilly greens. In June, as in January, slow-moving rivers of ice called glaciers covered the entire countryside. These glaciers were so thick that they would have buried today's tallest buildings. They were so heavy that the Earth's crust sank beneath their weight." And on this spot, "190 million years ago, a forest baked in the heat of endless summer. Evergreens shared the tropical sun with royal ferns that arched up as tall as trees. Petrosaurs spread their furry wings and swooped in the hot sunshine. Fabrasaurus nibbled on horsetail plants, and Amarasaur stretched its long neck to get some ginkgo leaves. Suddenly, a Dilophosaurus crashed through the trees and bushes. Her sharp fangs glistened. This dinosaur was looking for a different kind of meal." And on this spot, "220 million years ago, a group of Coleophysts fought over which dead fish near shore. Meanwhile, a Phytosaurus slipped its way into a shallow lake. When he opened his jaws, nearly 170 teeth swam toward the giant amphibian called Metatarso. Volcanoes smoked on the horizon. Clouds of steam billowed upward, rushing to meet the clouds in the sky. Lava spit out some of the volcanoes. It oozed and burped from others. Sometimes the lava flowed into boiling rivers of melted rock, so hot it took years to cool. Now and then, glowing droplets shot up from the earth hundreds of feet in the air, just like the water in a giant fountain." And on this spot, "300 million years ago, a mountain jabbed the clouds with its peaks. The mountain was so high that plants and trees could not grow all the way up its sides. It was so high up that the air on top was thin and hard to breathe. This mountain was a part of a range taller than any mountains in the United States today. Peak after peak were crowns of snow against the blue sky." And on this spot, "370 million years ago, waves rolled across a tropical sea. Coral reefs grew up from the seafloor below. Gardens of sea lilies swayed in the water like flowers bending in the breeze. But these sea lilies were really animals that strained tiny creatures out of the water for food. Giant squid-like animals housed in shells used their arms to walk on the sea bottom. Their arms also grabbed trilobites and other animals for dinner. Large sharks swam in these waters. They were hunted by an even bigger fish, or terrible fish, was about 30 feet long. Its jaws could crush a victim with just one snap. But on this spot, "540 million years ago, there was no sea. There was no mountain. There were no animals, no insects, or green leaves reaching for the sun. This spot was only rock as far as the eye could see, except for a dusting of algae. This spot looked a lot like the surface of our moon." Things changed. Over thousands and millions of years, the Earth changes. Huge pieces of land pull apart, leaving holes big enough to form oceans. Seas dry up, leaving fossils to tell the story of another time. Huge pieces of land press together and mountains push toward the sky. Giant glaciers bulldoze some of those mountains. Wind and water crumble others, one rock at a time. Over hundreds of thousands of years, people's lives change as well. Some of their cities disappear into history. Others, like New York, are still growing and changing. Long ago, kites were the only things people could fly high into the sky. Today, we launch spaceships. Our world and the way we live in it will continue changing. First a little, then a little more. Life will be quite different when your children have children of their own. Think of the moon that lights up our night sky. Astronauts have walked on the surface, but going there still seems as distant as a dream. In 100 years, who knows? On that spot. What there might be. And that is the end of the book called An Expedition Back Through Time on This Spot, written by Susan Goodman and pictures by Lee Christensen, and it was published by Green Willow Books, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishing. Hope you enjoyed the book and learning a little bit about history of New York and what had happened there. See you next time, guys.